Well, thank you, Lizzie, and good afternoon. I just want to make one correction to your introduction and say the only model I set for museum management was the attempt to stay in school as long as I possibly could. And that lasted until my wife said, you've got to cut it out. So, well, again, good afternoon. I'm delighted to be with you here and pleased to have been invited to speak, especially in the august company of Representative Leach. I've had the privilege of serving as director of 4 museums over the past 20 years. 3 of these possessed encyclopedic collections, which is to say they encompassed everything from the art of the ancient world to contemporary art and actively acquired works of art in all of these areas. Now, during my time as a director, several issues have profoundly altered the way we think about how we care for and continue to build our collections. The debates around these have focused appropriately on both the legal and ethical dimensions of collecting and our responsibility for understanding that this activity takes place, by definition, in cultural and political contexts in which outcomes must be, more often than not, negotiated. We've just heard from former Representative Leach about one of them, involving restitution claims made for works that were seized or forcibly sold during the period in which the Nazi Party was in power in Germany, 1933 to 1945. This is, to be sure, a complex issue and one we are still working our way through. But the second one, the collecting of antiquities and cultural property, is, in my view, even more complex and far broader and more consequential in its implications for American art museums and their collecting policies and practices. In the time I have with you this afternoon, I'd like to address 2 separate but related topics that have shaped my thinking on this matter. The first is the experience I had as the director of the Cleveland Museum of Art in evaluating a request from the government of Italy for the return of antiquities in its collection. The second is about the future of collecting antiquities and cultural property in a context in which the rules have changed and are likely to continue to do so in the future. Now, many of the conclusions I've reached on this subject were the product of my direct involvement, as Lizzie mentioned, over a number of years in discussions with the Association of Art Museum Directors about establishing and then enforcing guidelines that would govern the ways in which member museums continue to collect works not only of ancient art as it is conventionally defined, but also the art of different cultures throughout the world that is subject to laws established by source countries, as they are called, to protect their own national heritage. In 2007, January of that year, I received a letter as director of the Cleveland Museum of Art, from Maurizio Fiorilli, a lawyer who had been put in charge of a broad effort by the Italian government to identify and repatriate antiquities that had been, in its view, found and illegally removed from its territory. Fiorilli, later dubbed by an Italian newspaper the hunter of lost treasures, asked me to meet with him in Rome to begin a conversation about certain works of art in our collection, that is Cleveland's, not yet identified by him, in which Italy had an interest. The Cleveland Museum of Art was not the first institution to be issued such a summons. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, the J. Paul Getty Museum, and the Princeton University Art Museum had all been contacted before us. Now, each of these museums dealt with Italy in its own way, sharing little or no information with the others about either the process, what had been requested, for example, or on what basis this request had been made, or for that matter, how they reached decisions about which objects, if any, they would surrender to Italy. This was disappointing but not surprising to me. When it comes to acquisitions and collections, American museums have typically been competitors, not collaborators. And the details of their deliberations in this realm have always been treated confidentially, if not secretively. Now, in the event, see if I can get this to work. There we go. The Met was forced in 2006 to return the so-called Euphronius crater, the remarkable Athenian red figure vase dating to the late 6th century BC that had been acquired in 1972 with a provenance or history of ownership that was always considered doubtful and in the end proved to be false. It was a major, major loss for the Met's collection. As you can see, the drawing on this vase is amongst the most beautiful to be found on any work of Greek art. And the Getty, which pursued a different strategy and ended up being pilloried in the court of public opinion, volunteered that same year to return 26 antiquities to Italy, and in 2008 increased that number to 40 objects. One of these, a cult statue of the goddess Aphrodite dating to the late 5th century BC, was documented as having been illegally excavated at Morgantina in Sicily in the late 1970s. It was purchased by the Getty in 1988 from the British dealer Robin Symes for $18 million, a figure that eventually had to be accepted by its trustees as a sunk cost. So, by the time we sat down with the Italian authorities in the summer of 2007, I had already come to several conclusions. First, it was clear that Maurizio Fiorilli was not on a fishing expedition. That is to say, he would make his case on the basis of evidence that he and his investigators had assembled. Secondly, the experiences of the Met and the Getty had persuaded me that a cooperative rather than a combative approach to our negotiations was likely to yield the best outcome. It took roughly 2 years from beginning to end for the Cleveland Museum of Art to complete these discussions and come to an agreement which provided for the return of 14 works of art to the Italian government. It would not be particularly useful here to describe this process in detail, nor is there time for me to do so. Rather, I will limit myself to a few points that in retrospect turned out to be truly consequential. First, at our initial meeting in Rome, Fiorilli, again the lawyer leading the negotiations for the Italian government, took me and our lead counsel aside before the inquiry began formally and said quietly, "You should understand that what matters most is 1970. This was a reference to a document issued by UNESCO in that year entitled The Convention on the Means of Prohibiting and Preventing the Illicit Import, Export, and Transfer of Ownership of Cultural Property. What he, Fiorilli, meant to let us know, I soon came to understand, was that this date was considered by the Italians to be a bright line. Simply put, it was his way of communicating that anything that had been acquired by the museum before 1970, regardless of the circumstances, would not be subjected to a demand for its return. On the other hand, anything acquired after 1970 was fair game, and would be held to a higher standard. Precisely what that standard would be was not, at that time, entirely clear to me. Why, you might ask, was 1970 so important to the Italian government? The UNESCO Convention, which sought to discourage the troublesome and growing illicit international trade in antiquities, was not legally binding, and its acceptance by many countries took a considerable amount of time to accomplish. The United States Congress, for example, did not ratify it until the mid-1980s and turn it into law. And it was not until 2003 that the Association of Art Museum Directors, dragging their heels for a very long time, issued its first set of guidelines to bring the acquisition policies of its members into alignment with the 1970 UNESCO Convention. As I was later to argue in conversations with my colleagues as we revised the AAMD's guidelines on antiquities and cultural property, neither the Italians nor other source countries would give a fig about the threshold dates, 1983 or 2003, that American museums or our government might adopt for the establishment of higher standards for the acquisition of ancient art. Their goal, and I came in time to agree with them, was political. That is to say, to establish a broadly accepted treaty date after which the terms of engagement would change. And for them, this was 1970. I'll return to this a bit later. My second takeaway from our negotiations was the importance of making a distinction between fact and interpretation. The list initially presented to us numbered 35 objects. In the event, we returned, as I mentioned earlier, 14. Fewer than half from Fiorilli's initial request made the cut. In evaluating this initial list, we went to enormous lengths to examine our own documentation for each object, as well as the information that the Italian government presented to us. What we found was rarely conclusive when we put it all together. Indeed, what became evident to me was that the gaps in our knowledge about an object, its find site, and its subsequent history were significant, perhaps even more so than what we knew about it. And they prevented us typically from coming to a definitive conclusion about whether or not ownership should be transferred to the Italian government. Was a similarity of an Athenian vase in our collection to others that had been excavated at a particular site in Italy conclusive proof that it was looted from that place, especially given the fact that vases of this type also had been found in other parts of the Mediterranean? Or was the association of an object with a bad actor, such as the British dealer Robin Symes or the New York dealer Robert Hecht, enough for us to assume that it had been illegally exported from Italy, especially when we know that these and other dealers handled many objects that had been obtained legally and were on the market before 1970. And finally, how should we weigh the problematic issue of circumstantial evidence? The fact is that in many cases, we simply could not come to one conclusion or another with absolute confidence, and that many of the decisions, pro or con, that we were asked to make would require the exercise of judgment on the basis of incomplete information. Now, this calculus was complicated enough to persuade us to use a matrix, defining and weighing a set of attributes to help us make such assessments during our final negotiations with Fiorilli and his staff in Rome in 2008. In the spirit of transparency, we were also careful to explain the logic of our decision-making process to them. And by lunchtime of the day on which this meeting was held, I was told quietly that our Italian colleagues were frustrated because I hadn't yet agreed to give anything up. I explained that I planned to, but that the objects we agreed to return had to meet the threshold we had established for the evaluation of the evidence at hand. How else could I justify such a decision to our board of trustees? And indeed, by the middle of the afternoon, we had identified 13 works that we concluded on the basis of evidence should be returned to the Italians. Here are several. Oops, sorry, here's Maurizio Fiorilli, who clearly got into role. But here are several of the objects we did, in fact, return. This, a Greek raiton, or drinking vessel in the form of a donkey's head. Here, a Corinthian column crater from the 6th century. And thirdly, an Italian work, an Apuleion lekathos, with a vase with a very long neck. And then, after we'd agreed on those 13, in a gesture that demonstrated that we were indeed acting in good faith, I offered to return another object, a black figure vase that had not been on their list, but which our internal research had concluded or identified as having been illegally exported. And then we were done. A year before, in 2007, the Association of the Art Museum Directors convened a small working group of its members to revise its guidelines on the acquisition of antiquities and archaeological materials, first ratified, as I mentioned earlier in my talk, in 2003. I was asked to participate in this process, and in the discussions that followed, I argued, in the end successfully, that we should not choose 1983, when Congress passed enabling legislation, or 2003, the first date of the AMD's own guidelines, as effective dates for the application of new and more rigorous standards to be applied to the purchase of, or gift of works of art, of ancient art, but rather align ourselves with the rest of the world and accept 1970 as a treaty date, the bright line after which different and more rigorous standards of documentation should be applied. Based on the experience of our negotiations with the Italians, I also argued, again persuasively, that we should reserve the right to make exceptions to this general rule if, in our judgment, the information we had managed to gather about an object, even if incomplete, led us to conclude that it was likely to have been on the market before 1970. Now, to illustrate the value and the pitfalls, because it does cut both ways, of reserving the right to make judgments in the absence of complete information, I'd like to offer a few examples of works of ancient art that have been offered to or acquired by several museums where I served as director. Here we go. The first seen here on the screen is a statue most likely representing the Greek god Hermes, carved in marble from the Greek island of Thasos, a Roman copy of a Greek original dating to the 1st century AD. This was offered to the Cincinnati Art Museum when I was director there in 2004 by one of the principal actors in schemes to smuggle antiquities, the British dealer Robin Symes. Even at that time, well before he became the subject of legal prosecution, Symes's reputation was complicated, to say the least, and therefore it would have been easy simply to say, let's not consider this work since it is most likely guilty by association. Nevertheless, we took the statue on consignment and set out to find, if we could, documentation that would permit us to acquire it. And eventually we did. And I still remember vividly the day that Glenn Marco, our curator of ancient art, walked triumphantly into my office with a copy of a Parisian auction catalog from 1968 with an illustration of and an entry on this work, which had been placed on the market by a private collection in France. Another example. When I became the director of the Cleveland Museum of Art in 2006, I inherited this remarkable bronze, said to depict the god Apollo as a young boy, which had been acquired by the museum, again before I came, in 2004. It was a costly purchase, and from the outset, a controversial one, in part because although it had been sold as a Roman copy of a Greek bronze by Praxiteles, it was immediately anointed by Michael Bennett, Cleveland's curator of Greek and Roman art, as the Greek original itself. That remains to be seen. The real source of controversy, however, was its incomplete provenance. Its find site and source country remained unknown at that time and still remain unknown today. It was reported to have been in the early 20th century in a German private collection located in an estate in the territory occupied by East Germany, and was said to have been recovered from this estate and restored after German reunification. After extensive archival research and materials analysis, gaps in its provenance, its history of ownership, remained and will most likely never be filled. Was this enough information at hand to warrant its acquisition in 2004? After years of considering this matter, I still don't know. What I can say, however, is that as a matter of stewardship, it was perhaps a risk worth taking, because its acquisition brought this work into the public realm and made it the subject of scrutiny and debate. And indeed, it has remained the subject of scrutiny and debate for the last 15 years. And finally, one more example and a cautionary note proves the point of the old phrase, let the buyer beware. This monumental marble head, the subject identified as Drusus Minor, a son of Tiberius, was acquired by my successor at the Cleveland Museum of Art in 2012. It had been, in fact, offered to us during my tenure as director there, which concluded with my departure for Philadelphia in 2009, but I had rejected the recommendation by our curator to purchase it, largely because I did not trust the information we had received about its origin and its history of ownership. Apparently from North Africa, it was said to have been brought by a French family to Marseille in the early 20th century and had remained there until it came to auction in Paris in 2004. But conclusive proof had not been offered in support of this story. Research on this work continued after I left Cleveland, and apparently enough information was uncovered to place it indeed in Marseille before 1970, and therefore persuade the museum to acquire it. So all's well that ends well, except of course when it doesn't. Subsequent scholarship, which came to light after the Cleveland Museum purchased this work and published it, traced the work's origin not to North Africa, but rather to a fine site in a small town north of Naples. and determined that it had been looted from a local museum there in 1944 in the waning days of World War II. It was returned to Italy in 2017. So, what did I learn from these experiences? Well, I got my picture in a number of Italian newspapers and received a rather homely medal to honor my cooperation with the Republic of Italy. Beyond that, Maurizio Fiorilli stated that I had conducted myself as a gentleman, and more importantly, he said to us privately that we, Cleveland, were the best, by which he meant well-prepared and most thoughtful in our analysis of all the American museums with which he and his colleagues had dealt. None of this mattered very much. What did and remains significant is the way this forced me to think about the future of collecting antiquities in American museums. I'd like to spend the remainder of my time, even noting that I've run out of time, so Lizzie, will you give me a few more minutes, speaking with you about this, and to begin with an obvious point. If the date of an object's appearance in the marketplace is problematic or information about its provenance is scanty or non-existent, American museums, and I should add private collectors, should not consider acquiring it. Otherwise, why shouldn't we take a closer look and exercise our responsibility to make a careful judgment about an object for which we do not have all the facts that we would like to have in hand to make such a decision? And indeed, most of the objects we deal with today do come with an incomplete or somewhat problematic provenance. Now, one of the conclusions that I drew from these experiences and would like to share with you may seem to be an obvious point, but it is striking, at least to me, how much of the debate about this issue, about museums and antiquities, has focused almost entirely on the closely related questions of acquisition and ownership. As a consequence, relatively little has been said, at least in this context, about the related and very important museological functions of display, interpretation, and research. I find this especially bothersome because it obscures the classic question of the relationship between ends and means. In this regard, I'm reminded of what Philippe de Montebello, the former director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, once said, polemically, of course, that if the Metropolitan Museum of Art closed its doors to the public tomorrow, it still would be considered a great museum because of the scope and significance of its collection. Well, yes and no. Because it privileges one side of the equation, the goal of a general art museum to develop a great and comprehensive collection, over the other. To be sure, the continued development of our collections matters, and it matters deeply. But another equally compelling measure of an art museum's significance is how it uses the works of art that have been entrusted to its care. And this, the very heart of the museum's work, should be considered as much a matter of stewardship as it is a matter of ownership. This distinction between stewardship on the one hand and ownership on the other will, I believe, be one of the keys to this conversation about antiquities as it continues to evolve. It is also a distinction that is absolutely crucial for those of us who lead museums to keep in mind as we consider the ongoing relevance of our work and our responsibilities in an increasingly complex political and cultural landscape. Now, to support this position, let me offer you the following observation. The future of our general art museums depends on their ability to represent and enlarge our understanding of the history of art. As a corollary, as the discipline of art history continues to evolve, as it most surely will, as new discoveries reform our ideas and yield new insights into the development of visual culture, so too must our art museums, but they cannot do so without access to original works of art. And in this sense, I'm reminded of a conversation I had a few years ago with Julian Raby, then the director of the Freer Museum and Sackler Gallery in Washington. And in this conversation, he expressed the worry that because of a number of challenges to the continued development of its collection of Chinese art, the Freer's holdings in this field might eventually come to be seen as representing a history of Chinese art that was linked to the construction of railroads in China in the early 20th century. That construction generated a lot of archaeological material, and that's when the patron of the gallery, Charles Lang Freer, was in fact collecting. That is to say, it would be limited largely to what was new to the market then and available when Freer himself was collecting. To put this another way, Julian was concerned that the Freer's holdings of Chinese art would eventually come to be seen as an artifact rather than a living, evolving collection, and therefore over time less representative of the field as a whole as he would wish it to be as a director of one of this nation's foremost collections of Asian art. Now, as I've continued to think about Julian's concerns and about the constraints that museums face now in developing their holdings of antiquities and archaeological materials, I focused increasingly on this distinction between access to and the ownership of works of art. In the process, I've come to the conclusion, a fairly obvious one, I will admit, that in the future, access may not always assume the ownership of a work of art, but rather its custody in one form or another. While this idea may be anathema to some, especially those who are wedded to the idea of owning the objects they exhibit in the galleries devoted to the presentation of their collections, as opposed to special exhibitions, I should add, the alternative is, in my opinion, far more threatening, as Julian Raby had suggested obliquely in his comment to me, for it is likely to leave museums markedly less able to do the work for which they were founded, fostering a broader appreciation of the arts and a greater understanding of the diverse aesthetic accomplishments of human culture. Now, what then might this distinction between access to and ownership of works of art mean for museums in the future? First of all, it's important to acknowledge that if one has to choose, museums have a greater responsibility for stewardship, for the care of various types of cultural property and the dissemination of information about them than they do for the ownership of objects. Nevertheless, it is largely by the strength of their collections that our museums have been judged in the past and continue to be judged today. Indeed, the culture that favors acquisitions over other equally significant and productive curatorial activities is deeply ingrained in our institutions. In one sense, admittedly a rather narrow one, this is a matter of property, plain and simple, as well as civic pride and control. It is also in some ways a deeply parochial impulse that runs contrary to the aspirations for the creation and dissemination of knowledge that have long been and will remain the very foundation of our work. To illustrate this point, I will simply observe that in my opinion, most American museums, with some notable exceptions, still spend far less time and less of their resources on the research, publication, and distribution of information on their collections and their care than they do on enlarging them by purchase or gift. Now, what this means in practice, and I believe that this will be the case for the foreseeable future when it comes to antiquities and archaeological materials, is that American museums will need to direct their resources, human and financial, towards establishing stronger working relationships with source countries and more specifically with those governmental agencies, scholars, and institutions that can facilitate the granting of long-term loans of objects that may not augment our collections, but do have the potential to greatly enrich the experience that our visitors have of our museums and the works of art that they present. To put this more bluntly, collaborative relationships across national boundaries and all that these imply in terms of cost, diplomacy, bureaucratic red tape, and the development of different types of curatorial skills are not simply desirable. They are the new order of the day if American museums are to continue to fulfill their missions. The government of Italy, in fact, made such collaborations an explicit and important part of its negotiations with the several American museums, the Getty, the Met, Boston, and Cleveland among them, for the return of objects in their collections. And it demonstrated its willingness to enter into long-term loan agreements in the settlements it reached with each of these institutions. So I want to say, I'm going to stop here because I am running a little bit late. And I have made the principal point I want to make, but I want to end with a final note. I do regret that the time limit placed on these talks does not allow me to address a related issue, and that is the vexing question of so-called orphan objects. Works that typically have little or no provenance that have come into circulation since 1970 and continue to appear on the market. Some have estimated that there may be as many 100,000 objects today that fall into this category. And although it's not possible for us to determine the number with any precision, we can say with some confidence that it is significant and that it will continue to grow. And for this reason, the dilemma of dealing with objects that exist in a kind of gray market, as it were, is worth thinking about because it has a significant consequence for both art museums and for the fields of art history and archaeology. That, however, must be a topic for another session at another time. Thank you.
Running a little straight. Balcony? Yes.
Thank you for that illuminating and deftly presented presentation. I'm Conrad Harper of New York City. I have two, maybe three very quick questions. Number one, does the Philadelphia Museum today collect antiquities that do not have a provenance documented after 1970? And if so, do you explain in any public forum your reasons for doing so? And the other question has to do with loans. As you know, often people lend objects to museums, and then a few years later, the museums may decide to acquire. Do you have the same requirements, criteria, for acquiring after a loan as you do for buying on the market or receiving by gift?
I'm glad to say I have another 20 minutes to speak about this. And thank you for both of those questions, which are terribly relevant. The PMA does not collect antiquities or archaeological materials by virtue of historical circumstance. Philadelphia does things, as you know, uniquely. And in the case of its art museums, the Philadelphia Museum of Art is not a comprehensive museum like Cleveland or Philadelphia or even Dartmouth's, but rather it collects narrowly within a certain number of fields. Early medieval to the present day, nothing before. European, North American, some South American materials, and then East Asian and South Asian, so India, Nepal, and the related regions, as well as China, Korea, and Japan. The rest of the world and the rest of history is covered by the Penn Museum. And this was a tacit understanding that we had for a long, long time with each other, and it continues to this day. I often say that running a museum like this, I feel incomplete because museums do aspire in some way, shape, or form to be universal. And one of my great desires, closet desire, of course, is to have the Penn Museum and the PMA Museum come together and have the world see that Philadelphia has next to the Met the greatest encyclopedic museum in the United States. Okay, so we don't collect antiquities, but we collect cultural property from a lot of different areas, and we do scrupulously observe the laws of export that exist in each of those countries, and they're various and could be the subject of another and very long conversation. With regard to criteria for loans and collections, you hit on a very important point, because in the field, although we give lip service to the idea of holding loans that we ask for to the same standards as acquisitions, typically we do not. If an object is problematic, that's one thing, and we probably will not ask for it for loan if it's an antiquity. On the other hand, we don't press lenders often to give us complete provenance and make sure that every T is crossed and every I is dotted. And I think that's a shortcoming of the way that the AMD and American museums deal with this issue. Okay.
Juliet, good friend from the Bryn Mawr Film Institute. I wonder if you could comment on what I think of as a serious heist of art in the Philadelphia area, which is the deaccessioning of the LaSalle University Museum.
Are we are we being recorded?
Yes. Yes, probably.
That may be an answer.
I regret that, and I expressed that publicly to the president of LaSalle University, and said I objected strenuously to the decision that they made, and the Board of Trustees endorsed to deaccession works of art, because they diminished the museum as a resource for the university and a tool for teaching in doing so. I think they compounded the problem by taking those funds and using them for an entirely different purpose, not for the benefit of the museum. So I was mighty cross about that, yes.
Thank you very much. I thought your distinction between the stewardship function and ownership was a very crucial point to make, and I wonder how far you're prepared to go with that. I mean, in a certain sense, emphasizing the stewardship and the educational function of museums pushes you, I think, towards thinking of these works of art as public goods, of abandoning the notion of private property entirely, and perhaps thinking at a national scale or even an international scale about the sort of collective cultivation of these things, the collective care of them, and the collective transfer of them from place to place so that they may serve as broad a human public as possible. So should we just get rid of the idea of private property in this area entirely?
Thank you.
Well, I'm going to plead the fifth on this by saying that I am not trained as a lawyer, and there are many, many legal issues that are often brought to my attention when I talk about things like this. But I do think that collections are, in a sense, public goods anyway, and that's basically underscored by the tax status of American museums and the tax benefits we enjoy. For me, it's a liberating idea for two fundamental reasons. It is a fact that it's going to be difficult to collect works of art that have been newly discovered in various source countries and acquire them for our own collections. Export policies become increasingly restrictive, and so too has national legislation in many of these countries. So we're facing the question of either or if we approach this from the perspective of with the goal of trying to make an acquisition. If, on the other hand, we say we'd really like to stay current with the history of Chinese art or Greek art or Egyptian art as it's being revised by new finds and new excavations, how do we do that and do that effectively? The only way, really, in my opinion, is to join into partnership and say, we'd like to help you share this with the world. The question of ownership doesn't matter. The question of use rights and what you make of it does. And there are all sorts of different ways that one can work that through. The other thing that's really fascinating to me about this question and how it's resolved is that it takes this question of works that are in this gray area in the market, the orphaned objects that museums cannot touch today without violating their own policies, and it provides an opportunity for us to have a custodial relationship to them and care for them, make them public, hold them in trust, understanding that someone indeed may make a claim, and a legitimate claim for them in the future, but more likely than not, the information we need to make that judgment will never come to light. And why not have them in a public space where they can be studied and enjoyed? That's, for me, the key issue here and a key question of how we resolve this matter going forward. Yeah.